72 hours after my husband threw me out of our apartment. In front of his mother, I stood in a hospital conference room with my newborn daughter, asleep in a bassinet beside me, and I watched Marcus Reed's face go the color of old newspaper as the genetic counselor slid the paternity results across the table. 99.9% probability of biological paternity. His mother, Diane, made it sound like all the air had left her body at once. I didn't say a word. I had practiced not saying a word. But the hospital administrator sitting to my left, a woman Marcus had never met. A woman whose name wasn't on any document he'd signed. Clicked open a manila folder and said in a voice that could have stripped paint, "Dr. Reed, before we address the falsified timeline your mother submitted to hospital administration, I need you to understand that the photographer you threw out 3 days ago is the same Nadia Okonkwo who documented every stage of this hospital's NICU renovation. The photographer whose work is hanging in your chief of surgery's personal office. The woman your residency program asked US to find for your orientation materials, and we couldn't because she'd been caring for her dying father while you were in medical school. On her dime." Marcus looked at me like he was seeing a ghost. His mother looked at me like I'd just reached up through the floor. What neither of them knew was that I had spent 72 hours not crying, not begging, not breaking. I'd spent them building a case with the only tools I'd ever trusted: a camera, a time stamp, and the truth. Welcome back to Revengecamerastories, where quiet women with steady hands capture what people would rather stay hidden. And the lens never lies. If you've ever been called a liar by the person who promised to believe you, settle in. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And subscribe because this one develops slowly, but the image is sharp. Let me back up 72 hours, because the truth came before the test did. My name is Nadia Okonkwo, and I am 31 years old. 3 days before that conference room, I was standing in the small galley kitchen of the apartment Marcus and I had shared for 6 years, 7 months pregnant, when my mother-in-law walked in with a printout she'd pulled from God knows where, and a look on her face I'd seen before but never aimed at me. Diane Reed had a way of holding paper that made it look like evidence even when it was a grocery receipt. She set the page on the counter between the cutting board and my swollen hands and said, "I need you to explain this." It was a calendar. My cycle tracker from an app I'd stopped using 2 years ago. Dates circled in red pen that didn't match the dates. Marcus and I had celebrated when the test came back positive. "Diane, the math doesn't work." Nadia, her voice was calm. Surgically calm. Marcus was at his surgical rotation in Baltimore for 3 weeks during your conception window. He wasn't even in the same state. I felt my pulse in my throat, but I kept my voice level. He came home that weekend. The 18th we went to. I have his schedule. She tapped the paper. He didn't come home. He was on call. He switched with someone. He drove back Friday night. We celebrated our anniversary early. I said it plainly, the way you say something true that shouldn't need defending. Diane tilted her head. "Nadia, if there's something you need to tell us before this baby comes, now would be the time." The air in that kitchen changed. I felt it the way you feel a shutter click something. "There's nothing to tell. Diane, Marcus is this baby's father." She picked up the paper, folded it in half with the same precision she used to fold Marcus's childhood into the perfect narrative of a brilliant son raised right, and said, "We'll see what Marcus thinks." She didn't wait for me to respond. She walked out of my kitchen, carrying her little printout like a verdict. And I stood there with my hands on the counter and my daughter kicking under my ribs. Marcus came home 2 hours later. I heard his mother's voice in the hallway before I heard his key in the lock. By the time he opened the door, His face already looked like someone else's. Nadia, he didn't say it like my name. He said it like an accusation. Marcus, whatever she told you. Were you with someone else? The question hit me so fast and so cold that for a second I couldn't breathe. No. Then why doesn't the timeline match? I explained it again. The schedule swap. Our anniversary dinner at the small Italian place near the waterfront where we'd gotten engaged. I even told him what he'd ordered the pappardelle, because he always ordered the pappardelle and that we'd laughed about the couple next to us, who'd spent the whole meal on their phones. I gave him every detail a true memory holds, and I watched him weigh it against his mother's printout and choose the paper. I was on call that weekend, Nadia. I didn't come home. You switched shifts with Andrew Chun. You told me he owed you from the November rotation. I don't remember that. Then call Andrew. He'll tell you. Marcus looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something I'd never seen in him before. Not anger, doubt, the kind that's already made up. It's mine and is just waiting for permission to say it out loud. My mother thinks. I think, he said slowly, and I felt the floor tilt under me. I think you need to take a paternity test. The room went very quiet. I had given up a gallery show in Brooklyn to move with him to this city. I had worked reception, jobs, and weekend studio gigs too. Pay rent while he was in medical school, because his loans were deferred, and his mother's help came with conditions I refused to ask him to meet. I had held him through his boards, and his match day and every rotation that tried to break him, and he was standing in our apartment, 7 months into a pregnancy we'd celebrated together, asking me to prove the child in my body was his. Get out, I said. He blinked. What? I said get out. Nadia, I'm trying to. Get out of this apartment. Marcus. Right now. I don't know where the voice came from. It didn't sound like me. It sounded like my father, who taught me to print photographs in a darkroom when I was 9 and told me the most important thing about N. You either captured it or you didn't. I had captured the truth, and my husband was choosing to believe a calendar his mother had printed. He left. He didn't fight. He didn't apologize. He just turned and walked out, and I heard him in the hallway talking to Diane in low tones that sounded like strategy. An hour later, he texted me, I need space to think. I'll stay at my mom's. We'll talk when you're ready to be honest. That was Tuesday. On Thursday, I went into early labor alone. I called Marcus from the hospital. He didn't answer. I called again an hour later when they admitted me. He texted back, Is it mine? 3 words. Just the question that meant he'd already decided. I turned off my phone and I delivered our daughter with a nurse. I'd never met holding one hand and my father's Nikon the camera I'd carried in my bag for 15 years sitting on the table. When they put her on my chest, perfect and screaming and unmistakably alive, I looked at her face and I saw Marcus in every angle. His nose, his brow line, the shape of her ears. And I took a photograph. Not with the Nikon, with my phone. One shot, her face next to mine. Timestamp, 11:47 p.m. I didn't know yet that I'd need it. I just knew I wanted to remember the moment. Comment betrayed if you've ever been. Should have believed you. And keep watching. The 72 hours are just starting. Here's the thing about my husband and his mother. They knew a version of me that was true but incomplete. And they'd mistaken incomplete for the whole story. They knew I was a photographer. They knew I did headshots and engagement shoots and the occasional wedding. Small work. Decent money. Nothing that threatened Marcus's trajectory. What they didn't know, because I'd stopped talking about it the way you stop talking about a language you used to speak was who I'd been before I became the woman in Marcus Reed's apartment. I grew up in Detroit, the daughter of a Nigerian engineer and a Polish-American nurse. And my father was the kind of man who believed a photograph could tell a truth a person couldn't. He shot documentary work for local papers and taught me to see the way some fathers teach their daughters to ride a bike. Patiently, repeatedly, until the balance was instinct. By the time I was 23, I'd had my work in a group show at the Detroit Institute of Arts. By 25, I'd been hired to document the rebuilding of a historic hospital's NICU, a project that took 14 months and ended with my images hung in the chief of surgery's private office and printed in the hospital's annual report for 3 years running. That hospital was here, in this city, the same teaching hospital where Marcus would eventually do his residency. Though we didn't know that yet when I took the job. I met Marcus the year the NICU project wrapped. He was in his second year of med school, exhausted and brilliant and kind in the specific way of someone who hadn't yet been worn down by the system. We fell in love over cheap tacos and long nights where he'd quiz himself on anatomy, and I'd edit photos, both of us building our separate futures in the same small room. When he got into the residency program here, the one attached to the hospital I just photographed, I was so proud of him I cried. When my father got his diagnosis 6 months later stage for pancreatic, I could keep chasing gallery, shows and editorial spreads and the version of my career that lived in clean white rooms with my name on the wall. Or I could go home. I went home, sleeping on my childhood bedroom floor and learning the language of hospice. Marcus stayed here for his residency. We did long distance. We stayed on the phone. He said he understood. And maybe he did, in the beginning. But by the time my father died and I came back, something had shifted. I wasn't the promising photographer he'd met anymore. I was the woman who'd paused. The woman who'd been away. The woman whose gallery was gone and whose name had gone quiet. And Marcus needed help with rent. So I picked up my camera again. But differently. Smaller weddings instead of institutions. Headshots instead of exhibitions. I told myself it was temporary. Temporary became 2 years. Then 4, then 6. I stopped mentioning the Dia show. Not because I was ashamed. Because every time I brought it up, someone would ask what I was working on now. And I didn't have an answer that didn't sound like I'd given up. Marcus's mother certainly thought I had. Diane Reed measured worth the way she measured her son's achievements. In titles. In salary. In the visible shape of success. To her, I was a photographer the way someone is a hobbyist. A nice girl who took pictures at weddings and didn't ask her son for money. She had no idea the chief of surgery her son's attending. The man who would decide. She had no idea because I'd never told her. And neither had Marcus, because I don't think he remembered. Or if he did, he'd filed it under the version of my life that didn't matter anymore. Comment forgotten. If you've ever been reduced to the smallest version of yourself by people who used to know better. I spent the first 12 hours after my daughter's birth doing what every new mother does, not sleeping, feeding a person who didn't yet know how, and trying to understand that my life had split into before and after. But somewhere around hour 15, when the nurse came in to check my vitals and asked gently if the baby's father was coming, I felt something in me go very still and very clear. I looked at my daughter asleep in the bassinet beside me, and I picked up my phone, not to call Marcus, to open my photos, not to the delivery further. 7 months. To the weekend Diane said Marcus hadn't come home. And there it was. A photograph I'd taken of Marcus asleep on our couch the morning after our anniversary dinner, his face half buried in the pillow. The light coming in from the window we only had in that first apartment. The one we'd moved out of 4 months later. Timestamp: Saturday, April 19th, 7:23 a.m. I stared at that image for a long time. Then I opened another app. The one I used to organize my professional shoots. The one that logged metadata. I pulled up every photograph I'd taken that weekend. April 18th, 11:14 p.m. Marcus and me at the Italian place. His arm around my shoulders. The waiter's hand half in the frame because I'd asked him to take it. April 19th, 7:23 a.m. Marcus asleep. April 19th to 47 p.m. Marcus leaving. His duffel bag over his shoulder, kissing me at the door. Every image stamped, geotagged verifiable. I had documented the weekend that. Diane said never happened the way I documented everything in my life that mattered. With a camera that didn't know how to lie. I called the hospital's patient advocate line. I explained calmly that I just delivered a baby whose father was a resident in their program, and that there had been a situation involving his mother making false statements to me and possibly to hospital staff. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just said I needed to speak to someone in administration about a potential ethics issue involving family interference in a patient's care. They transferred me to a supervisor. The supervisor transferred me to risk management. Risk management transferred me to someone whose title I didn't catch but whose voice told me she'd handled worse. Her name was Laura Winters. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you still have the photographs?" "Yes." "And you're willing to provide them, along with a timeline?" "Yes." "Ms. Okonkwo, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Has anyone from this hospital told you that Dr. Reed's paternity?" "No, but his mother implied she'd spoken to someone in administration about the dates." Another pause. "She did. She called our residency coordinator yesterday and question about paternity that might affect Dr. Reed's family leave request." "Ms. Okonkwo, I'm going to be very clear with you. What Mrs. Reed did is not just inappropriate. If she misrepresented facts to our staff to interfere with a resident's standing, that's a serious issue for her and potentially for him, depending on what he knew. He asked me for a paternity test. Did he do so in writing?" I opened my messages, found the text, read it aloud. Laura Winters exhaled slowly. "Okay, here's what I need from you. Send me everything. The photos, the timestamps, the messages. I'm also going to arrange for a hospital-administered paternity test, which we'll do at no cost to you. And we'll have the results in 72 hours. If the results show what I think they're going to show, we'll be having a very different conversation with Dr. Reed and his mother. The kind where they learn that this hospital doesn't tolerate false accusations against patients or staff and Ms. Okonkwo. Yes, I pulled your file when you called. I know who you are. I've seen your work in Dr. Mendez's office. My breath caught. You photographed our NICU renovation. We tried to bring you back for our new pediatric wing 2 years ago, but you'd gone off our contact list. My father was sick. I'm sorry. Thank you. The reason I'm telling you this is because I want you to know that when we sit down with Dr. Reed in 72 hours, he's not going to be facing some random patient he can dismiss. He's going to be facing a woman this hospital has been looking for, and his mother is going to be facing the consequences of slandering her. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was clenched. Thank you, Laura. Don't thank me yet. Just send me the files. I did. And then I turned off my phone, and I fed my daughter, and I slept for the first time in 3 days. Comment evidence if you've ever had receipts when someone thought you had nothing. 72 hours later, Laura Winters called me from a hospital line and asked if I was well enough to come to a meeting. Dr. Reed and his mother are here, she said. The paternity results just came in. I think you should be in the room when we go over them. Do I have to be? No, but I think you'll want to be. She was right. I dressed carefully. Not for Marcus. For me. I put on the one good shirt I'd brought to the hospital. The black one I used to wear to gallery openings back when I still got invited to them. I put my father's Nikon in my bag. Not because I planned to use it, but because I needed him there. And I walked into that conference. Room with my 3-day-old. Daughter asleep in her bassinet. He looked terrible, unshaven, hollow-eyed, like he hadn't slept. Good. Diane sat beside him, rigid as rebar, her purse in her lap like a shield. Laura Winters sat at the head of the table. And next to her was a woman I didn't know hospital counsel. I'd learned later and across from them, Dr. Mendez, the chief of surgery, the man whose office held my photographs. Marcus saw him and sat up straighter. The reflex of a resident in the presence of his attending. Laura didn't waste time. Dr. Reed, Mrs. Reed, thank you for coming. We've asked you here to review the results of the paternity test administered at Ms. Okonkwo's request. She slid the paper across the table. Marcus picked it up. His hands were shaking. I watched him read the number. 99.9%. I watched the color drain out of his face. Diane grabbed the paper from him, read it herself, and made that sound that airless. Collapsing sound, and I felt nothing. No triumph. No relief. Just the heavy, tired weight of having been right all along. Laura continued. Dr. Reed, we also need to address the timeline. Discrepancy your mother raised with our residency. Coordinator, Ms. Okonkwo, has provided us with photographic evidence time-stamped and geotag that places you in her apartment on the weekend in question. April 18th and 19th, the weekend she conceived. Marcus looked at me. Really looked. You took pictures. I always take pictures. Marcus. Laura pulled up the images on her laptop and turned the screen toward him. The restaurant. The couch. The door. Every moment Diane had said didn't happen. Captured and stamped and undeniable. You switched shifts with Dr. Chen, Laura said. We confirmed it with the residency office. You were off that weekend. Your mother's timeline was incorrect. I didn't know, Marcus said, and his voice cracked. I didn't, Mom told me.